Stakes Fantasy Network. I'm your host, Greg Ambrosius, and I'm joined today by one of the pioneers of the fantasy baseball industry. He is Ron Shandler, the founder of Baseball Forecaster and BaseballHQ.com. Ron, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Greg. This is terrific. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to talk. But first, I have to ask you, what's the weather like in West Palm Beach, Florida today?
Well, I'm in Port St. Lucie, a little bit
Okay.
north of there, but it was in the 80s today and
Ooh.
quite sunny and quite nice. We had a little thunderstorm a little while ago, but a little bit warmer than where you are right now.
Yeah, like I said, we had a storm last night too. It was 13 inches of snow. It's the second time in the last 3 weeks, I think, that we've had 13 inches at one time, and it's no fun. But I'm going to Las Vegas in a week, and so I'm looking forward to that. So, hey, I did the math today, and I figured out that you and me have combined over 70 years of experience in this industry. Now, I know that makes us both sound old, which we are,
We are.
but it's a lot of time spent growing this industry, wouldn't you
Mhm.
say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we were there at the beginning when this first became commercially viable,
Yeah.
when people started writing books and creating games and basically creating this game in the late 80s. Yeah, we were right there at the beginning.
Yeah, so let's talk about the history of fantasy baseball. It was started it was called rotisserie baseball, right?
Mhm.
Glenn Wagner, Daniel Okrent did that in
Yep.
1980. The official rotisserie rule book came out in 1984. That's
Mhm.
what got me interested. We were
Mhm.
playing Stratomatic, APBA, and a
Mhm.
guy found this book and said, "We don't need to get together every night. We could do this once a year." You started the Forecaster, Baseball Forecaster in 1986.
That's
Tell
right.
me how you came up with the idea and what was the target audience for the book?
Well, it really wasn't fantasy related at the
Yeah.
very beginning. I stumbled over the Bill James baseball abstract and the Rotisserie League book in 1984 during the summer on the same visit to a B. Dalton's bookstore.
Oh,
And
nice.
yeah, and I was just like, oh my God, and it really was a visit that changed my life.
Yeah.
I was really into the baseball statistics. I was working as a forecasting analyst for a publishing company, and I was just totally enamored with how Bill James was looking differently at traditional statistics.
Yeah.
So my first book, the first edition of the Forecaster, really was just a sabermetric type of book. It was looking at the work of Bill James, the work of Pete Palmer, the work of Thomas Boswell. They were all developing their own new statistics to evaluate players and things like that.
Yeah.
And I thought it would be interesting to see their work side by side and to see which one was better. And I was personally interested in how my Mets, my New York Mets, were evaluated. So yeah, so the first Forecaster was basically a sabermetric book. It wasn't until the third edition that I found out that the people who were reading the book were fantasy leaguers, and I was knee deep in fantasy baseball at that point. So I said, "Well, what can I do with this book to make it more marketable to fantasy leaguers?" And I added player projections, I added
Mhm.
player rankings, and from that point on, it just all exploded.
Bill James doesn't get enough credit. I just read Alan Schwartz's book, which is a fabulous book, The Stats, History of Stats, basically.
Mhm.
And Bill James really doesn't get enough credit for how many people he sucked into baseball because there were people like him out there, like you're saying right now. You love the whole analytics of it, right?
Yeah, and there were a lot of people doing some really good work back then,
Yeah.
and it was interesting for me also in looking at the Rotisserie League book and Bill James. I didn't realize at the time that Dan Okrent actually discovered Bill James.
Yeah, right. I read that. Yeah.
Yeah, so he was the
Hmm.
one who first wrote about Bill James, and even
Yep.
the first few abstracts were published by some of the founding rotisserie fathers.
Yeah.
Peter Gathers was an editor that published one of the first books. So there was really a kind of a marriage between these two disciplines. When at the
Yeah.
beginning I kind of thought sabermetrics and fantasy were two different things, but we all became integrated at some point.
Yeah, Daniel Okrent was writing for Sports Illustrated at that time, went out,
Mhm.
interviewed Bill, wrote the story, and couldn't get it in the magazine. They didn't like it, and he had to fight very hard for it. So you're,
Yes.
you're right.
Yeah, I remember the story. Bill had written that in California Angels games when Nolan Ryan was pitching, the common wisdom was that they had a larger attendance in games
Mhm.
that Nolan Ryan was pitching, and Bill had written that it's just simply not true, and he proved it. And when Okran tried to sell that to Sports Illustrated, they said that's ridiculous. It's just not true, and
Yeah.
he had to get past those obtuse gate thinkers in order to get that article published. But eventually, he did.
Yeah, great. So when did you start playing fantasy baseball, and was it like AL only and NL only, just like the book?
Uh, my I found the book in the summer of 1984,
Mhm.
and the ship had sailed for that season already.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to wait until the following year to start playing fantasy. And I was living in New Hampshire at the time, and I had a bunch of buddies who were into hockey. My first experience in fantasy was a fantasy hockey league that we just built ourselves based upon the rules that were in the rotisserie book. We figured,
We're
well,
breaking news here. Ron Shandler started in fantasy hockey.
my very first player I ever bought in a fantasy auction was a Pittsburgh Penguins rookie named Mario Lemieux. He's the
Good
very
job.
first player.
You knew what you
Yeah,
were doing. You knew what you were doing.
yeah. So we
Yeah.
played hockey that fall. We had a blast, and the following spring we played baseball, and then it just took off from there.
Was it NL only then or AL only?
No,
No.
we were all like we were in New Hampshire, so we were Bruins fans. We were
Yeah.
or New York Islanders fans because we had a lot of New York transplants. So we decided we were going to just play with the National League East and American League teams.
Oh, wow.
So we were just Eastern Division teams,
Oh,
which actually the founding fathers would have agreed with because
yeah.
they were so against mixed leagues back then.
Right. Right.
So if we were just drafting from half of each league, that they would have agreed with that, and that's what we did.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
So people don't realize you had a job in '86, right? In fact, you kept the job all the way up until '94. What were you doing for a living then?
I was getting constantly fired from jobs in the publishing industry. I was not a very good employee. I was working for several publishing companies, including Doubleday and Company,
Mm.
and yeah, I was rising up the ladder in the marketing departments. My last job that I got fired from, I was a director of marketing for a newsletter company in Boston. I learned a ton in those jobs, and I
Yeah.
have to say that my marketing expertise really played a very key role in helping me grow my business in the early days. So I owed a debt of gratitude to that. But yeah, I was a marketing wonk in those days.
Well, so I think you went full time in '94 before the strike season. Is that true? And what made you decide, okay, I'm done being a marketing wonk. I'm going to do this for a living?
Well, I got fired from that job a week before the week before the players went on strike. And I told my wife, I said, yeah, okay, I lost another job. And we had two toddlers at home,
Yeah.
but I said, these players are never going to go on strike.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. It'll
Yeah.
never happen. A week later, they went on strike. So we kind of muddled through for about a year, and then we picked up stakes in New Hampshire and moved down to Virginia,
Mm.
which is where we ended up raising our girls. And
Yeah.
it worked out pretty well for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk a little bit about your feelings during that strike. I want to give a story of mine and then you as well. But in '94, like you said, we didn't think it was going to go past September 1st, right? It
Right.
started August 11th. Well, they're
Mhm.
not going to miss the playoffs. They're not going to miss the World Series.
Right.
Then they do that and it goes into the off season and it doesn't get settled until April. The start of the season didn't even happen. My story is my first child was due in March of it was actually St. Patrick's Day of 1995, and she came 6 weeks early. Well,
Mhm.
we did three magazines at that time. We canceled the first one because they were still on strike. We
Mhm.
canceled the second one; they were still on strike. The third one, we said February 15th, we got to get a magazine out there. So I was running between the hospital and back and forth for 9 days because she was in the hospital for 9 days, and then it finally hit the publication. They weren't even playing yet. They finally settled. I think it started like April 28th or something
Right.
like that.
Mhm.
Stress, stress, stress is my point. It was just stressful. How about you?
Well, yeah, stress. There's a lot going on that year. Well, for starters, I was publishing a newsletter and my annual baseball forecaster, and the question was, do I keep publishing? Now,
Yeah.
Krause decided to cancel a couple of your issues,
Yep.
but my from my experience in the publishing industry, publishing newsletters, I thought if I stop, I'm really going to take a big hit. I've got to keep publishing and finding something to write about.
Yeah.
And I did. In fact, myself and John Benson, we were the only newsletter publishers back then that continued publishing straight through the winter,
Hmm.
keeping our regular schedule as much as we could. And then when the strike ended, it was kind of a frenzy because it was resolved on like April 2nd. We had 3 weeks. They
Yeah.
had to crunch 5 months of activity into 3 weeks. So those 3 weeks were crazy. Hundreds of players moved teams, and we had to kind of figure out a way to catch up. And again, this is basically pre-internet,
Yeah.
so
Right.
everything is being done with uh, prehistoric means of
I
communication.
know.
So
We were going to talk about that because you weren't baseballhq.com at that point,
no,
right? Were
no.
you sending out newsletters? Were you physically mailing them? Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Every month, first week in a month,
Yep.
we had a 24-page newsletter with this goldenrod cover that people had come to recognize, and we were going out the first of every month.
Yeah.
There was the newsletter, and then the annual book at the end of the year.
Yeah.
Mm.
Uh, so when you went to baseballhq.com, I think you were one of the first ones to really embrace like a website with might have been 96 or something like that. But I
Right.
remember when you went to baseballhq.com, I was like,
Mhm.
what is this internet thing anyways? I mean, seriously, don't you believe you were one of the first people to transform into that?
Yeah, I was one of the first, and
Yeah.
yeah, at the time I was just looking at what was going on, and I was seeing things, all the activity that was going on in AOL and
Mhm.
CompuServe and
Right.
Prodigy and the Usenet news groups, all the amazing conversations and discussions going on in Rec Sport Baseball
Mhm.
Fantasy, and I said, well, there's so much room for content on these sources. I've got to be able to break away from paper
Yeah.
somehow. And so I didn't realize how big a deal it was when we launched Baseball HQ. But when I did, I was called into into these conferences with the major publishers, asking me to speak at these conferences about how to convert a paper newsletter into a
Yeah.
website. I said, "Oh, I guess this is really big."
Yeah. You're
But
the authority.
yeah, the circulation of the paid circulation of the website surpassed that of my newsletter in just 9 months, and
Mm.
just kept going and going and going. So yeah.
Wow, that's unreal. When did you know that MLB clubs were actually reading the forecaster? Do you know when that was at all, or when they've also being on baseballhq.com?
Yeah, I was getting letters. The very first Major League Baseball executive who purchased the baseball forecast was Tal Smith.
Hmm.
And then,
Houston.
yeah, then there was the whole string of Pat Gillick and uh, gosh, I can't even remember names anymore. Theo Epstein eventually got a copy, and
Yeah.
we were in the front offices of probably about
Hmm.
15 ball clubs at some point in the late 90s.
Wow, that's awesome.
Mm.
One of the things that we don't do well enough in our industry, and you mentioned a couple guys, is really honoring those early writers. I mean, we did talk about John Benson, obviously, but Alex Patton and so many others. And you and I are in the Hall of Fame, and we've been honored for we. But I think we're honoring so many fantasy football guys right now, and they all came a decade after we were out there, and Alex and everybody. I
Mhm.
mean, don't you think like there are people that influenced you that a lot of people don't even recognize right now?
Well, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Alex Patton myself because back in 1991, I got a personal letter from him saying that he had come upon the forecaster and we had never corresponded or anything,
Hmm.
and that he was going to pull some information from it for his book. And so, yeah, so the next year I buy a copy of Alex's book, and I'm on like 40 different pages
Oh
in the
yeah.
book. He basically put me on the map.
Mm.
He was comparing my projections with those of Bill James and John Benson, and suddenly I'm in this elite company. So
Wow.
he was huge in putting me on the map, getting me recognized and known in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you were doing your projections, you were doing your own model, or what were you using for your own projections?
Yeah, I was a spreadsheet guy
Hmm.
way back. I mean, I was doing it in the publishing companies I was working with, and I was taking basically the same tools
Yeah.
that I used to project sales for
Hmm.
these companies, and finding ways to apply them to baseball statistics. And early on, it was just simple things like moving averages and nothing too comprehensive. But as I got deeper and deeper into it, I discovered different things that work better than other things, and started tinkering with the numbers a little bit more, and suddenly finding ways to capture skill in a way that others weren't doing at the time, and my readers started noticing, so
Yeah.
it helped sales. Yeah.
Wow, cool. All right, let's talk about the start of labor in 1994. We
Mhm.
both received calls from John Hunt of USA Today.
Right. Mhm.
It was the inaugural league. I didn't even know John Hunt knew who the hell I was, right? I
Mhm.
mean, here I'm an editor for 5 years of Fantasy Baseball magazine. He calls me up and asks me if I want to join this league. Absolutely, John. Do you remember the call that you got from him, and what did you think at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I basically got the same call, and the way he sold me, he says, "You'll be playing against Bill James
Yep.
and Glenn Wagner." It's like, gee, how can I turn that down?
Yep. Yep.
So, yeah, so we I remember that very first conference call.
Yeah.
We, I, we were living in New Hampshire. We had an unfinished basement, and we had just carved out this like 10 by 10 little spot in the corner, put up a bunch of drywall and a phone line, and I sat there for 7 hours
Yeah.
listening to people bid on baseball players, and it was, yeah, it was,
That's
it
what
was,
people don't realize. It was a telephone auction. That's what it was. And we talked about this last week in Florida, but John was very disorganized. He was a hell of a guy, but he was very disorganized. And when he got us all on the phone, we only had 11 guys for the AL auction. So he was going around the office at USA Today trying to get one more person. He finally got one more person. Okay, we're ready to start. And we're all on the phone. I didn't have a speakerphone. I was doing this the whole time.
oh God.
I know it. Seriously. And I was trying to type because I was using John Benson's software. I, full disclosure, had never done an auction league before. I had always done drafts. This was my first one. John Benson said, I'll send you the software, type in the guy's name, it'll tell you what he should go for. That thing was so beautiful. Except for I was doing it like this. So it was
Oh,
really tough. But when we were ready to go, then he introduced that this is the AL auction, and Keith Olbermann said, AL? I thought it was going to be the NL. I can't do this. I can't embarrass myself. And John goes,
click.
oh, yeah. He goes, we have NL tomorrow. Do you want to get in that? Yes, I'll do it tomorrow. Click. Well, now we're down to 11 again. Do you remember that?
Yeah, well, I was in the NL auction,
Yeah.
so I got all this afterwards that next night, hearing all this stuff going on. It's
It
yeah.
was crazy. He had to go find somebody else, and he found one more person, and then we got started. But it took forever. It worked out pretty cool though. But that was interesting. I want to ask you. People don't realize how powerful John Hunt's column was in USA Today Baseball Weekly. I've got a story of how he affected me. Did he mention you at all, and did that affect your business?
Absolutely. He
Yeah.
he probably was the single person who helped grow the industry in the mid 1990s,
Yep.
because um, everybody just waited on his Wednesday column in Baseball Weekly coming up, and he's basically a bellwether for all new products that come out. And
Yep.
he had a section of his column devoted to a new product every single week, and
Yep.
we were all clamoring to be able to get into that column. And I know he put Roto News on the map,
Yep.
RotoWire now.
Yep.
There were a lot of people who basically would not have been successful in the industry had he not mentioned them in his column. It was amazing how much impact he had.
Right. And he knew it. And so most of us were begging him to put our company's name in there. I never begged him. He put us in there, and it helped Fantasy Baseball Magazine. But in 1996, a true story, we had our top 200 and we had our dollar values for all of our players in our magazine. Well, it went to press February 15th. So by the time March came, it was kind of outdated. Right. So in 96, I said, for $5, if you want an updated cheat sheet with updated dollar values, I'll fax it to you. John put that in there, and we couldn't stop faxing for $5. It was just like a money machine, and it went on and on and on. And when we got to draft day, we had over 1,000 people that wanted it for $5 each. By 97, the internet had taken off. We didn't fax a single one. It was lived 1 year thanks
Yeah,
to John Hunt.
yeah. I mean, there are so many stories of what the types of things that people did to try to get his attention. I know
Yeah.
some people sent him box seat tickets to ball games, and I mean, care packages. I mean, it was like this romance we had with John Benson.
Yeah. Well, Well, and let's talk about
John
that
Hunt.
because
John Hunt.
it's John Hunt,
Yeah.
yes. One of the things that John only did with labor was to do the auction results, and then
Mhm.
he never followed the leagues the rest of the year, and that was a bugaboo for some of us who were trying to win this damn thing, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
So, but one of the reasons I think John he just didn't want to be bothered by people. He didn't think people cared about that, and it was John's vision that we're going to get the draft results and then we move on. Nobody cares about who wins this or whatever. That turned out to be a bugaboo, especially for you, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are a number of things. I you know, Baseball Weekly basically ran labor for their own self-interest. I mean,
Mhm.
and my biggest gripe with them was that um, starting in 1996, once we got off the telephone, we all had to travel to get
Right,
to the labor draft.
right.
And I thought that they were using our information and the free publicity that we were giving them in our own publications without any type of compensation. And I wasn't looking for money. I was just looking for them to put my 800 number or my website name in along
Mhm.
with my picture in the newspaper, and they wouldn't do that. And I thought that wasn't really fair of them. So that and the league itself, John, the first couple of years there was a number that we called into to
Yeah,
do our moves each week,
right.
and John, I mean, it was a USA Today number, it was a Baseball Weekly number, and apparently John had access to those calls, and before he made his own fab moves each week, and we thought that was a little bit of a conflict of interest. So,
Yeah,
I mean, there were overall, labor was so important to the industry, but
yeah.
I mean, there was these little things here that were kind of bugaboos.
Yeah, people don't realize that was the first experts league in the industry.
Right.
Fantasy football had nothing like that.
Mhm.
Nobody had anything like that for most of the 90s was the first. I mean, I should have thought of that with our magazine. I should have got 12 industry guys together. Never
Mhm.
even thought of that before John did that. And the first 2 years, we did it on the phone. Not only do we do it in 94, we did it in 95 too.
Mhm.
And then John invited us down to Florida. I think it was Kissimmee. I'm not sure, but I think it was Kissimmee.
It was
And we
St.
got down
Petersburg.
there.
Mhm.
Was it?
It was St. Petersburg,
St.
yeah.
Petersburg, okay,
Mhm.
and the one thing I remember was I was kinda nervous I didn't ever meet any of these guys. I know I had
Right.
never met you before, so I was
Mhm.
kinda nervous, like, how are they gonna accept me? I get there, and I get down there kinda late, and Larry Labadini's got Cuban cigars by the pool, and everybody's smoking Cuban cigars, drinking beer, and I was like, "This is my kinda group," so I just had fun. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I don't remember the Cuban cigars, but I remember Larry Labadini.
And speaking of Larry Labadini, he won the AL. He
Mhm.
beat me in the last shortened week in the AL. I finished second that year in 94, finished last in 95. I was terrible in 95, but Larry Labadini then in 96, our first live auction in the
Mhm.
AL, he went $9 pitchers.
Yep.
No one's ever done it since, and he
Mhm.
almost came close to winning that league. Do you remember that one?
Yes, he did. He not only did he draft a $9 pitching staff, but I think 4 or 5 of his batters are also $1 players. He spent, I think, 248 of his $260 in the first hour of the draft, and he just almost what you guys did in labor
Yeah,
this
I
year.
know it.
And he sat back and he he kind of the way I remember it is that he basically sat on his team for about a month and a half, 2 months to see how the pitchers were doing, to
Mhm.
see how his batters were doing, and then he started trading
Yeah,
to get
right.
some pitchers. And he was very close to first place at one point, but
Mhm.
then he lost. I think it was Sammy Sosa during the summer, and he ended up in fourth place, 8 points out. But pretty amazing accomplishment given that he started the season with a $9 pitching staff.
Yeah, unbelievable. So you told me something last week that I did not know. You said Peter Gammons was not in labor. To this day, I
No.
swore he was in labor, and he was a selling point of why we all wanted to get in.
I mean, I have that first Leviathan issue that John Hunt put out in 1994, and he is not in it. I've got the
Wow.
list of all the competitors who were in those two leagues that year, and I don't think Peter Gammons was ever in labor, as far as
Yeah.
I know. Certainly not when I was
No, he
playing in
wasn't in
labor.
after that for
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. I did not know that for sure. Okay. So in 97, I believe it was, you started Tout Wars.
It was
Talk
98.
98. Okay.
Mhm.
So 98. And you were still playing in labor at that time, weren't you, or not?
Up until that point, yeah, I
Yeah.
was playing through 97. I was playing, yeah.
Yeah. And so talk about why you decided to do Tout Wars and what does Tout Wars stand for, by the way?
Tout Wars doesn't stand for anything really,
Okay.
but
I thought it was like a newspaper war or something like that.
no, I mean it was a takeoff on the Star Wars at that
Okay.
point, and actually, the name was coined by Alex Patton.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but after 4 years of in labor, and I think the the administration of the league had deteriorated over that time, and I thought that they didn't hold a monopoly on putting together a bunch of
Hmm.
experts and having a league. So I sent out went on a fishing expedition, sent out an email in January of '98 to see if anybody would be interested in starting another league. And the key points in that league is that it would be run by democratic process. We would be the owners of the league.
Hmm.
We would promote it ourselves through our own websites. And our goal was basically to spread the gospel of fantasy and promote our own products, really, because it's sort of an exhibition. And uh, the response to the email was immediate. And Erwin Zwilling of Zwilling and Lenny Melnick, he stepped up and he said, "I can get us a place in New York City where we can hold this draft, make it a media event." He was a CPA in the entertainment industry, so he had connections all over the place. And so the first Tout Wars draft in 1998 was at the All-Star Cafe in Midtown Manhattan. We
Okay.
had camera crew from MLB. We had a gallery with spectators. The former major leaguer Billy Sample was at our auctioneer for a good part of the draft. We had a blast. It was great, and that was the kickoff for Tout Wars.
Great. But you came back and you played in labor again because you won 2001 NL labor, correct?
Yeah, I came back the following year in
Okay.
'99, and the reason I came back in '99 is that's when you guys were first putting together the Fantasy Sports Players Association.
Yes.
And so that was an event that was going on in '99, and I wanted to be a part of that. So
Mhm.
I invited myself back in.
Yeah, we started the Players Association, which meant we were trying to protect the players. At that time, there were companies that were running contests and taking the money and running. So we felt like
Mhm.
we needed an association not to give us a black eye and to, talk about there were legislators that wanted to regulate us. They thought we were gambling and such like that. And it was great. I mean, we got key people in the industry to step up, and then I started the trade conference in 2000. So it was great. But the year that you won 2001 NL, that's when you left money on the table. Did you start the Lima plan at that time? You got guys like Paul LaDuca for $3
I
who
know.
just went off that year, right?
Yeah, Lima was actually in the first Tout Wars draft in '98.
Okay.
Um, here's the thing, and this is funny. When we started Tout Wars in '98 was the year of the expansion. The National League went from 12 teams to 14 teams to 16 teams, and so we had this bright idea that we would increase the size of the NL only draft from 12 teams to 14 teams.
Hmm.
So we had a 14 team NL only auction. I mean, redefine the whole concept of a deep league.
Yeah.
And so there were no players to draft, but I I had my eye on this pitcher whose statistics were horrible, but had underlying skills metrics this was the sabermetric stuff I was doing at the time, had underlying skills metrics that I thought really showed some promise. So about 2/3 of the way through the draft, I opened the bidding dollar on Jose Lima. And everybody thought I was crazy. He went for crickets, and ended up winning 16 games with a 3.70 ERA and $23 profit on my investment.
Pretty good.
Yeah, so that was the beginning of the Lima plan, and looking for pitchers with the skills metrics, not necessarily the traditional statistics that we play the game with.
So is the Lima plan a $1 pitcher or a guy like you say who has the skills who goes for $1 or goes for low amount?
It's basically Lima turned out to be an acronym for low investment mound aces, and basically it ignores ERA and WHIP and just looks at pitchers with extreme skills metrics, no matter what they're going for. And we found that a lot of relief pitchers, middle relievers, third or fourth starters had good skills, just weren't given the chance to play, or just hadn't put up the good numbers before, but had that potential. And those were the guys who tended to be undervalued in these drafts. So that's how you found profit when you were doing your drafts.
So who were those guys in 2001 labor then that you won it with? Do you
Oh
remember?
gosh, I'd have to
No?
look back. I don't remember.
Because
Yeah,
that was
but
a crazy.
I did leave money on the table. In fact, Jonathan Mayo and I
Yes.
won AL and NL that year. And
Yes.
between the two of us, we left $36 on the table or
Oh
something
yeah,
like that. Yes.
Jonathan left like 23 or
Yeah,
something
and
like
I
that.
left the
So,
other 13. Yeah.
and he dominated the AL,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
crazy stuff. All right, let's talk about your next great idea, which was the Arizona Fall League.
Mhm.
You and Rick Wilton, Michael Jordan's going to the Arizona Fall League. He's a star, but he's going to try baseball. And you guys decided to hold some type of conference there. Talk about that. And what year was that?
Yeah, I this was really all Rick Wilton.
Yeah.
He was running a company with his partner Jim Dressel, called Sports Journal Publications, and they decided that they were going to try to do this conference out in Arizona. Now, the thing that was crazy about it, it was during the baseball strike. This was
Oh, okay.
November of 1994, which I thought was crazy. But they and I'd asked him, I said, why now? And he said, well, we know we're not going to do really well, but we want to get the bugs out. So yeah, I was involved with that later on. But that first conference, and this is a running joke because it's just so bizarre to think about. They had 13 speakers show up
Mhm.
and only 8 attendees.
Yeah.
So, but it was cool because it was
Yeah.
just 21 guys who were rabid fantasy leaguers. Some
Yeah.
of us were writers, some were just players, and we just had a great time.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
just and from there it just started growing every year. When Rick's company went under after the
Mhm.
following spring after the strike, um, the whole concept of that conference I thought was worth saving. So then I took it under the wing of the baseball forecaster,
Mhm.
and a few years later we rebranded it as First Pitch Arizona, and
Mhm.
it's grown into this great media event.
Yeah, it's fabulous. I mean, this last year I thought was the best one. I mean, just the content is just through the roof these days, and I think you'll admit the audience has changed from a lot of older audience to there is young baseball guys that are excited and doing podcasts and stuff. I mean, Ron, I don't know about you, but I'm seeing a bright future for the fantasy baseball industry because there's these 30 somethings that are coming in doing these podcasts just playing baseball as well. I mean, and you see that at the Arizona Fall League Symposium, right?
Yeah, it's true, and it's gratifying to see that because,
Hmm.
to be honest, I was a little bit worried because I would be doing survey of my readership over
Yep.
each year, and one of the questions I'd ask is, how old are you? How old are you? Just to get a sense of the demographic age. And when I first started doing the surveys in the late '80s, the average age was about 37,
Yeah.
and then every year it keep going up and up and up. And by the mid 2000s, the average age was like in the 50s, and I'm
Yeah.
thinking we're going to age out. We
Yeah.
need an infusion of young blood.
Yeah.
So to see this now, and not only just really smart guys, I
Yeah.
mean, just
Hmm.
really smart guys, and I think the future for this industry is very bright.
Yeah, the one thing I noticed at the Arizona Fall League Symposium is it started out with a lot of AL only and NL only questions. It really seemed like local guys that wanted to dominate their league, and they came there for some input so that they go back to their home leagues and kick ass.
Mhm.
Now, and I'm not saying this because I run the NFBC, but man, every topic, every panel seemed to talk about NFBC 15 team formats and such. And, I hope that we've helped that as well. But don't you see people are talking more mixed leagues right now and deeper 15 team leagues as well?
Yeah, and yeah, and I think for a lot of people that's become the standard,
Mhm.
and a lot of it's because so many writers in the industry back in the late 2000s, when the NFBC was first
Mhm.
starting to grow, were writing about it, we're participating in the NFBC, and we're bringing it back to their own readership.
Right.
And I think that built the NFBC brand and helped to grow that, and to move the focus towards that game format as more of a standard. You
Mhm.
know, I think back also, Todd Zola actually started the first experts mixed league in 2003, and it was an 18 team mixed league. And that was at that time the only way people would play mixed leagues.
Yeah.
In fact, when we were starting Tout Wars, we floated the idea of doing a mixed league, and
Mhm.
guys said, we're not going to do a mixed league unless it's 24 teams.
Yep.
So to settle now, which I think is a really nice balance of draft population and free agent population, the
Mhm.
15 team mixed league makes a ton of sense. And I we've really gone away from the only
Yeah.
league format, and the 15 team mix really works.
Yeah, I came up with this at the Arizona Fall League Symposium in 2002. I went and saw WCOFF in September. I came out there for the first time. You asked me to speak. That was the first year I came out to Arizona Fall League was 2002 because we were going through the licensing issue and you wanted me to speak on how the business side of the industry was going. I
Right.
went to the Phoenix Stadium and I didn't bring a jacket because I was stupid and it was freezing that night. I was there with Charlie Wiegert and John
Yeah.
Zaleski. And I said, I want to do high stakes baseball, but I don't know how many teams. I don't want to make it easy. 12, I'm not going to do. And Charlie said 14 and Zaleski said 16. And I got on the plane and I thought, 15 is a good number. There's 30 teams. That's half the field. I
Yeah.
think 15 is the right number. And so I did it, but I couldn't get my company to agree to it. I came back the next year and I announced that you let me speak again. And I announced that I'm doing this thing. And I thought, I wonder if anybody will even think this is good, worthy of doing. I get off the stage and there's Gene McCaffrey and John Mena, and they go, "Count me in, Vegas."
Yeah.
I'm like, I got one out
Yeah.
of 300. I think I'm going to make it.
Yeah, Gene would be the first one in for sure.
But it was true. I came up with the idea at the Arizona Fall League and I announced it there. And it's changed my life as well. You talk about changing your life. It certainly changed
Yeah.
my life as well.
Yeah.
All right. So 2008, you decided to sell the company.
Yes.
And I want to ask you why you decided to sell the company. I know you and I had some conversations and you had told me who you were getting bids from. And I'll tell you what, you made the right decision. I'll say that.
Mhm.
You sold to USA Today, and that was the better of the two by far. Why did you decide to sell at that point?
Well, a couple of reasons. For one, I kind of thought I had taken it as far as I could myself, and I figured I needed a bigger company behind it in order for it to grow.
Mhm.
I had been a solo entrepreneur for 20 some odd years and starting to get burned out a little bit.
Mhm.
My kids at that point were, teenagers. I wanted to be able to spend a little bit more time at home. And I was wearing every single hat. We, at that point in 2007 was like a peak year. We published 5 books that year,
Mhm.
5 different books. Um, we were we our first pitch Arizona expanded to local conferences in 15 cities across the
Right.
country. We had about 50 writers and analysts working for us, and although I had editors and folks helping out, and Ray Murphy and Brent Hershey basically were taking on more responsibility at that point, I had I wanted to do something different. I wanted to have an
Yeah.
opportunity to branch out and do different things. So at that point, I thought, look, let's see if really the opportunity to sell the company fell in my lap. I wasn't actively looking for it, and
Yeah.
I had 3 suitors at that point,
Mhm.
and it seemed to work out okay.
Yeah. And so you still worked with them for 5 years, correct? That was part of your agreement?
Part of the agreement was actually a 4-year contract
4 year?
to work with them, and it was actually Fantasy Sports Ventures that bought us out, and they ended up selling to USA
Oh, okay.
Today.
Mhm.
Yeah, and USA Today kept me on. I'm still basically working for USA Today, just in a much lesser capacity than I was back then.
You're retired. Everybody thinks you're
I
retired.
am not retired just because I moved to Florida. No, 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 no.
So how involved are you in the forecaster right now, or do Brent and Ray do most of that?
Brent and Ray do all the heavy lifting. I write the introduction. I have final edit over everything that goes in the book
Okay.
because my name's on the cover, and I wouldn't let anything go out
Yeah.
with my name on the cover unless I had final edit.
Right.
So yeah, that's basically I'm involved with the forecaster, and I'm still under contract to front the first pitch events. So
Mhm.
those 2 things, I'm still under contract with USA Today.
So you moved from Richmond to West or to Port St. Lucie. What year was that? Were the girls already out of the house then at that point?
Yeah, it was
Okay.
Roanoke, but yeah, we moved down here in 20 full time in 2016. The
Huh?
girls were out of the house. They basically graduated college and off
Mhm.
doing their own stuff. And Sue and I had decided, well, it's time to check things out down here. I was actually following the real estate market in Florida
Yeah.
for a while and waiting for it to kind of bottom out after the recession. And when it started going back up again, I said, okay, now's the time. And
Yeah.
so we bought a place in Port St. Lucie here, and now I get to see my Mets all March.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're loving it, right?
Oh, I am. I am very
Yeah.
much so.
Awesome, definitely. All right, so let's talk about the history of our industry. I believe you're writing a book. Let's talk a little bit about that. When's it coming out? What's the history of it?
Sure. The book is, I think the book's going to be called Fantasy Expert. That's the way I entitled it. I'm hoping my publishing company decides to keep the title, but it's sort of a historical memoir about the early days of fantasy baseball. It basically through my experiences. So it talks about
Mhm,
Bill James and those early writers, Alex Patton and Peter Gollenbach. It There are chapters about the start of labor, how the whole chapter on how tout war started. Have a chapter about the beginnings of the Fantasy Sport Players Association and your
mhm.
involvement. I have your origin story that I pulled together from different things. I saved so much stuff.
That's your
I,
problem.
I, I have to tell you, Greg. I mean, and I give you a ton of credit. This Fantasy Sports Magazine was an incredible source
Mhm.
for all this information, and especially in the 2000s when you were doing every issue industry news.
Yep.
I mean,
Yeah.
just phenomenal stuff that was in that magazine that helped piece together different parts of the history and
Well, the interesting thing, and I appreciate the compliment, I was the president or the chairman of the FSPA when we started it. And
Mhm.
so we didn't have any money. In fact, when we put on the first labor in '99, we were bankrupt. We were out of money. We spent more than we actually had. And so I said, I knew our company would run the trade conference and we would front it. And so we would do that. And so if anybody wanted to sign up, they had to call me. And then I started doing this newsletter because I was hearing about new companies that were coming into space and it was really interesting. I'd interview the guy, like, heck, I'll put it in the magazine. I wasn't like John Hunt, but people were really lobbying me to get in the magazine about their new
Mhm.
business, and I was getting all that information. So I was at the perfect place at the right time for sure. But I miss Fantasy Baseball Magazine, man. That was like my baby for 20 years.
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely relate.
Yeah, I
With
did. I
some.
was Fantasy Baseball Magazine for 20 years, and this is my 20th year of NFBC. So I knew I was
Oh,
going to last this.
wow.
I have no idea what happens after year 20, but it's been fun to do it for 20 years. That's for sure. So, hey, I got to ask you, what's your thoughts on DFS? I mean, when they came in, they weren't trying to grow the industry. That's for sure. They were trying to accumulate names. They knew what they were going to do with the software. They saw
Mhm.
legalized sports betting down the road. I've never badmouth DFS because I think they brought in a new generation of maybe players who found season long. But what's your thoughts on how the DFS FanDuel DraftKings came in 2009, 2010 and just uplifted our industry?
Yeah. I think part of this whole thing is that my focus has always been on long view analysis, and everything that I've written about over my career is about being able to project performance over 6 months
Hmm.
and careers. So to be able to basically have a game that is over in one day, um, there were things I just didn't like about it. Most of which is that the only thing you can project with 100% accuracy pretty much is playing time, but
Yeah.
skills, performance are all over the board. Um, and There's a continuity in fantasy baseball where you're managing a team over a course of time, and that I think is the beauty of the game.
Hmm.
Just picking a dozen players for one night just didn't have the same attraction to me.
Yeah.
Now, it's a great game. I've played it. I enjoy playing it. I try not to play it too often because it can be addicting.
Hmm.
And when I play it, I want to do well. So I'll spend hours just crafting a single lineup, and I just don't have time to do that.
Yeah.
So I think the way they went about it at the beginning, I don't know. I had some problems with that. I always thought that the UIGEA would have
Hmm.
prevented a game like that from happening.
Yes. It's why a lot of us didn't get into that space
Ex-
because it was
exactly.
crossing that thin line and we didn't want to
Right.
cross that thin line. You had to have multiple teams, multiple days, I thought it was, over a stretch of time. And they just walked that line and nobody pushed them off of it.
Yeah. So the thing that was my biggest problem with DFS ultimately is that when things blew up in
Mhm.
was it 2015, 2014.
2016, yeah.
So yeah, when
Mhm.
things blew up, they were trying to drag full season fantasy under the bus with them.
Yep.
And that was unconscionable for me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but
Not only did they try, they did, because I'm licensed in 22 states right now. I have to pay licensing in 22 states because the state legislators think I'm FanDuel and DraftKings, like I got
yeah,
disposable income to give away.
yeah.
UEJA covers us. We
Mhm,
are running it exactly the way they say. I won't go on, but yeah, that was a bad thing at that point.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so let me ask you about legalized sports betting, because that, of course, is the next step. It went
Mhm.
from, you could talk about fantasy to DFS to legalized sports betting. It's all connected. It's all connected.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on how that's taking off right now?
Half of my book is about how we were trying to sidestep the whole perception of gambling
Gambling.
for
Yep.
all those years. I
Yep.
mean, um, when Pete Rose was nailed back in 1988,
Yep.
thereabouts, Major League Baseball just didn't want to get involved with anything that even had the sniffing of gambling,
Correct.
and so we were not able to, in the fantasy sports industry, we're not able to really make major inroads with them. We wanted their approval, but they wouldn't give us the time of day because fantasy was gambling. So we worked very hard to kind of separate ourselves from that.
Hmm.
And now we're in a situation where it's legal now, and it's basically changed everything. I personally don't have the gambling gene. I
Hmm.
don't participate in that other than a few random prop bets before the
Right.
season begins. But it's really a whole new ballgame now.
Yeah, I think people didn't understand when they wanted to say fantasy was gambling. Well, I'll tell you one thing: a gambler doesn't give you the money at the beginning of the year and get paid 7 months later. A gambler, he wants it that night. At the end of the night, I want my money back, or I lost my money. I'll try again tomorrow. Fantasy sports was never gambling. Yes, there was an entry fee, and
Mhm,
what was the most? $50 I paid, $100 I paid. I don't even think I ever did pay $100. It was the thrill of beating your friends
mhm.
in the competition. The money, well, you needed the money to just keep everybody skin in the game, but I just don't think people understood in the 80s and the 90s that the number one reason we played was not the money, right?
Oh, right. I mean, since I came in through the sabermetric entrance, for me, fantasy was just an intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
I was trying to be able to project how players were going to do, and fantasy was my way to prove whether I was right or wrong. And I'd always go after the players who I thought were undervalued or
Hmm.
would do better than other people thought. And that was the thrill for me. I mean,
Yeah.
grinding through 6 months
Yep.
of roster management and figuring out who was the best players over that period of time. That it was an amazing amount of satisfaction at the end of the year winning a league like that.
Yeah, definitely. So you're into analytics. So the one thing I never embraced that you invented was the term fanalytics, because I can't say it for one reason. It's on the cover of Baseball Forecaster. Explain fanalytics and why don't I get it?
I Greg, I
It's
hate
fantasy and
uh,
analytics, right?
yes, but I hate the term fantasy.
I know you do.
I hate it. I've always hated it. It's like it's like we're Dungeons and Dragons. That's fantasy. Unicorns and that's
Mhm.
fantasy. What we do is not fantasy. What we do is real. It's real analysis. It's real uh, planning, and it's a real intellectual pursuit. So to call it fantasy, I just had a lot of problems with it. So back in the mid 2000s, at some
Yeah.
point, I decided let me see if I can change it. It was way too late at that point, but I figured let me see. Let me put out a call and see if we can get a new name for this game.
Yeah.
And so I put out a call on Baseball HQ, and I got like 200 responses. And John Hunt picked it up, and he did a column on it, and he got a whole bunch of responses. So we went back and forth on it, trying to figure out the best name. And he wrote another column with the results, and I wrote another column with the results, and we landed on Fanalytics. And I thought that was a pretty good name. John kind of gave it a real kiss off in his column. He said it's too many syllables.
Yeah, that's what I think. Yep. Well, I will tell you, I get some credit for the term fantasy, and I've never told this story. I've saved it for the book, but it's a true story. So, before the first issue of Fantasy Baseball magazine in the fall of 1989, I sent a written letter to Glenn Wagner and asked him to write the foreword. Okay. I
Mhm.
thought it would be really cool to have the guy who wrote the book write the foreword in our first issue. And he sent me back a letter, which I have downstairs, and I'm going to frame it someday and show it. But he sent me a very nice letter saying, Krause Publications is probably the right company to do this magazine, and we wish you all the best of luck. But if you use the term rotisserie, we will sue you. So you need to put the trademark R and all of that. I went into my publisher, Bob Lemke's office. I showed him the letter. He's like, now what are we going to do? Because we're going to call it Rotisserie Baseball Magazine. That was the name of our magazine when we were designing it all. I said, let's just call it fantasy baseball. I play fantasy football. Everybody calls it fantasy. This is 1989. Everyone called rotisserie baseball and fantasy football. We made the cover Fantasy Baseball Magazine, and not that I had anything to do with it, but I think fantasy kind of took off from that point that it was fantasy baseball. Who's calling it rotisserie baseball, right?
So it's your fault.
I think partly my fault. How's that? Plus, I couldn't spell Fanalytics on the cover of a
Oh.
magazine, right? Hey, I got to ask you a question, and
Yeah.
somebody had asked this. What is there any other? I can't find the question here, but is there any other sport? You said hockey. Did you ever play fantasy football, for crying out loud?
Recently, I've played it a few
Okay.
years, but um, the original fantasy hockey league that I was in, we lasted for maybe 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
The baseball league lasted for about a decade.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the strike took its toll. We did basketball for a year or two. Never did football. Never did football.
Never did football.
Yeah.
All right, here I got a question from David. He said, "Did either of you have interaction with the original rotisserie guys, Okrent, Wagner, Sklar, Wolf?" I've got a good story. I'll let you go first. Did you have interaction with those guys?
I've had a lot of interaction with Glenn Wagner before he
Yep.
passed away. In
Yep.
fact, when he was inducted into the FSTA Hall of Fame or the FSWA Hall of Fame, I forget, he wasn't able to make it,
Right.
and I offered to stand up in his presence and accept the award and give a little speech for him,
Right.
which was one of the biggest thrills of my career, to be
He
honest.
was the first one we inducted, and he didn't
Yeah.
show up, but he
Mhm.
did write a letter that I believe you read,
Mhm.
and he wrote that for ESPN the magazine. It was in ESPN the magazine as well.
Mhm.
I was on pay-per-view with Glenn Wagner. ESPN did this in 1993 or 4. It was a pay-per-view, and
1994.
it was great to meet Glenn there. But I
Mhm.
have a great story of Daniel Okrent, and I have been in touch with Dan. I've been talking to him recently because I do want to get some of his viewpoints. Dan and I were invited to be on Good Morning America in 1994 with Charles Gibson. USA Today had written a story on opening day in the business section about how fantasy baseball is taking off, and they quoted me on some of the numbers of players playing and such like that. The next day, I get a call from a lady who says she wants to fly me to New York City. I'm going to be on Friday night or Friday morning with Charles Gibson and Daniel Okrent. Great. I'm from Iola, Wisconsin. They fly me to Manhattan. I get a hotel room, get up early in the morning, got a limo waiting for me. I get to the green room. There's Daniel Okrent. I shake his hand. I say, thanks for everything you've done. And he does his line. I feel like Oppenheimer, the guy who invented the atomic bomb. I can't believe what I've done. I'm laughing. I thought it was a shtick, right? And we're talking. We get on the set. Charles Gibson asks him the first question. He repeats the same thing. I feel like Robert Oppenheimer. I've invented the atomic bomb. I can't even go to the bathroom in a urinal without somebody pulling out their yellow piece of paper.
Oh
I'm on
God.
national TV just with my mouth wide open. They come to me. I'm like, oh, this is great. It's taking off, and such like that. But that was the last time I was with Daniel Okrent. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, he's actually said that on several occasions. I've
Yes, he
seen it
has.
printed. He's uh, he's also he's also said another classic line, and it's in my book too. He says, I could have resolved the conflict in the Middle East and found a cure for cancer, but my tombstone will still read invented rotisserie league
Right.
baseball."
And think about Daniel Okrent has done so much, right? I
Hmm.
mean, he's written
Yeah,
what, 7 books or something like
yeah,
that.
7 or 8 books. Yeah.
He was the ombudsman with the New York Times, so I
Mhm.
understand where he's coming from. That's for sure. So interesting. All right. So last 2 questions I have for you. One, you do feel that the industry is on good footing right now. When you and I go to our retirement and are done with this is going to continue on for a while, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. I'm interesting to see how the sports betting plays out and what type of effect it has on fantasy. But I think we've got good legs. We've got a good foundation for this industry, and
Yeah.
it'll do well.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So, what do you think your legacy is in the industry? And do you think anybody will remember the two of us from the early years when we're all gone?
That's kind of why I'm writing this book, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, I was there at the beginning. I've been around for let's see,
About 37, 38 years.
it's I can't keep track anymore. I should keep track because the number on this book is the same number of years I've
That's
been
right.
married, so I should be able to.
And how many is that?
37.
37. Okay. So,
um, so yeah, I mean, I was hopefully I've had an impact on some people in their enjoyment of the game. I think it's all about the enjoyment of the game,
yeah.
and uh, during tough times, being able to turn to fantasy sports as a release and a recreational activity. It's
Mhm.
we were there after 9/11, and we had the conference. Just a
Yep.
few weeks after 9/11, and being there when you need us to be. I think fantasy sports is important, and I hope I contributed to that.
Well, fantasy sports is all about community, and you have a community there, and
Mhm.
that's what I love about the NFBC. I mean, anybody can run the online drafts, but the live events, the community that we have, the friendships that I know our guys have formed, that's what it's all about, and that's why I keep doing it, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's actually the underlying theme of my book. It's
Yeah,
all about community, and the community that were created in labor and in tout wars, the community of my readers at Baseball HQ, on the forums, and just
yep.
contributing. I mean, I'm sh- I'm sure if I was in the league with half of my readers, they'd whip my butt, and
I
that's
know.
good. That's
Yeah,
good. I'm
yeah,
glad of that, and we've created this community of competition, and First Pitch Arizona's community. Uh, it really is. I think community in general is important in our lives, and I'm happy that we've been able to create these communities through fantasy sports.
yeah. There's worse ways to make a living, that's for sure. I mean, you could be a
That's
marketing director, you could be accountant. My accounting teacher from high school still thinks I'm an accountant because she's, oh, you're going to be the best accountant. What a boring job that would have been. I want nothing to do with
oh
that.
gosh, yeah,
All right. Well, when you have the name of the book, you let me know. When you
okay,
have the release date, you let me know. Maybe we'll
I
come
will.
back on and talk about it because I'm really looking forward to it.
Sure,
And I'm going to write one day, but it's going to include fantasy football and all of that other
sure.
stuff. So, but
Mhm.
really look forward to seeing it. Ron, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We'll do it again someday. All right.
Absolutely. Greg, thanks so much. I will send you an advance copy so you'll get to see it.
Thank you very much. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. We had a nice crowd here. You can watch it on our High Stakes Fantasy Network anytime you want if you missed all of it. But good talk with Ron Shandler. Thanks everyone. Talk to you later.